Jahannam. This is the first and uppermost level of the fire, and while its name is frequently used in the Islamic tradition to refer to the entirety of the penal realm in the hereafter, it specifically designates the first gate and the highest tier of punishment. The linguistic root of the word carries meanings associated with a deep, bottomless pit and a frowning, sullen appearance, reflecting the grim reality that awaits its inhabitants. According to classical Islamic theology and the explanations of early scholars, this uppermost level is primarily designated for the sinful believers among the monotheists, those who acknowledge the oneness of Allah and the truth of His messengers, but whose scale of bad deeds ultimately outweighed their good deeds, and who died without having made sincere repentance. The Islamic concept of divine justice establishes that no sin goes unaccounted for. And while the foundational belief in monotheism ensures that a person will not remain in the fire for eternity, their unrepented transgressions in the worldly life must be purified. The inhabitants of this level are those who neglected their obligatory duties, such as the daily prayers or the fasting of Ramadan, or those who engaged in grave moral failings, such as consuming unlawful wealth, dealing unjustly with their families and neighbors, or yielding to the destructive desires of the self. As described in the prophetic traditions, all of humanity will cross the Sirat, a bridge established over the expanse of the fire, which is described as thinner than a hair and sharper than a sword. The righteous will pass over it with varying speeds, guided by the light of their faith and good deeds, while those weighed down by their unrepented sins will lose their footing and fall into this first level. The torment here, though the lightest in comparison to the depths below it, is still unimaginably severe, with the heat described as being 70 times more intense than the most blazing fire of the worldly life. Yet, it is exclusively regarding this gate that the profound Islamic concept of Shafa'ah, or divine intercession, manifests most prominently. By the ultimate mercy of Allah, the prophets, the angels, and the righteous believers will be granted permission to intercede for those they know in the fire. Eventually, through the boundless mercy of the Creator, any soul that possesses even a mustard seed of genuine faith in its heart will be extracted from this level, bathed in the river of life, and admitted into paradise. Thus, Jahannam serves as a temporary abode of rigorous purification for the believers who compromise their faith with persistent disobedience, standing as a stern warning to the Muslim community that mere verbal declaration of belief does not grant immunity from accountability, and that everyday actions, moral integrity, and immediate repentance are essential components of a sincere religious life. Ladha, the second gate of the fire, takes its name from the linguistic concept of a blazing, leaping flame, a fire so intensely kindled that it fiercely licks and strips away whatever it touches. Mentioned explicitly in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'arij, this level is described as a raging fire that strips away the scalp and the skin, calling out to those who turned their backs on the divine truth and busied themselves with gathering wealth and hoarding it. The exactness of divine justice is deeply reflected in the nature of this specific punishment, where the physical stripping away of the skin perfectly mirrors the spiritual reality of the sinner who stripped themselves of human empathy, moral responsibility, and divine protection during their worldly life. The inhabitants of this gate are characterized by two profound spiritual diseases: the active rejection of the clear message of faith and the obsessive accumulation of material wealth, accompanied by a refusal to fulfill the financial rights of the poor and vulnerable. In the Islamic worldview, wealth is not an absolute possession, but rather a sacred trust, or amana, bestowed by Allah to test humanity. When a person gathers wealth and tightly withholds it, refusing to pay the obligatory zakat, ignoring the cries of the destitute, and believing that their accumulated fortune grants them independence from their Creator, they succumb to the illusion of self-sufficiency. This arrogance leads them to turn their backs on the moral imperatives established by the prophets. The leaping flames of Ladha continuously call out to these individuals, recognizing them by the very traits of greed and heedlessness they cultivated in the world. The psychological torment of this level is compounded by the realization that the very wealth they dedicated their lives to hoarding, protecting, and worshipping could not purchase them a moment of respite from the divine recompense. The relentless nature of the fire reflects the relentless greed that consumed their hearts in the worldly life. Islam teaches a profound balance between engaging in legitimate worldly commerce and maintaining an unwavering detachment from materialism in the heart. The existence of Ladha serves as a terrifying deterrent against the spiritual blindness caused by avarice, reminding the believer that true security does not come from overflowing bank accounts or hidden treasures, but from spending in the path of righteousness, fulfilling the rights of creation, and turning one's face toward the Creator rather than turning one's back in arrogant dismissal. Al-Hutama. The third gate derives its name from an Arabic root meaning to break, crush, shatter, or grind into pieces, indicating a fire of immense crushing pressure and devastating intensity. This level is vividly described in Surah Al-Humazah, which specifically designates this abode for the slanderer, the backbiter, the one who relentlessly mocks others, and the one who hoards wealth with the delusion that their fortune will render them immortal. The Islamic tradition places an extraordinarily high value on the sanctity of human honor, considering a person's dignity to be as sacred as their blood and property. Consequently, the sins of the tongue, such as ghibah, which is speaking ill of someone in their absence, and namima, which is maliciously spreading rumors to cause division, are categorized among the most destructive of all major sins. The individuals condemned to al-hutama are those who spent their worldly lives systematically crushing the reputations, spirits, and dignity of others through mockery, gossip, and deceit, while simultaneously shielding themselves behind their amassed wealth, thinking their social status made them untouchable. In an act of profound and terrifying poetic justice, just as they crushed the honor of their fellow human beings, their own bodies and bones are relentlessly crushed and shattered in the depths of this fire. Furthermore, the Quran explicitly notes a unique characteristic of al-hutama. It is a fire that uniquely leaps up over the hearts. Classical commentators explain that the fire specifically targets the heart because the heart is the anatomical and spiritual vessel where these particular diseases, arrogance, malice, envy, hatred, and the false sense of superiority, take root and fester. The heart was the very source of their sneering contempt for others, and thus it becomes the epicenter of their agonizing recompense. The description of this gate concludes with the terrifying image of the fire being closed in over them in extended columns, symbolizing a state of absolute, inescapable confinement and overwhelming despair. Just as they close their hearts to compassion, empathy, and truth in the worldly life, the vault of divine justice is closed over them in the hereafter. The profound lesson of al-hutama is a permanent injunction upon every believer to aggressively guard their tongue, to immediately cease all forms of gossip and character assassination, to purify their inner thoughts of unwarranted pride, and to recognize that true longevity and honor are found only in righteous character, not in the arrogant accumulation of transient wealth. The fourth gate is named for the concept of a fiercely blazing, continuously raging, and actively kindled flame, representing a fire that is never allowed to subside or cool. This specific level is frequently referenced throughout the Quran, most notably in connection with two distinct but equally grievous categories of transgression: the unjust consumption of the wealth of orphans, and the stubborn rejection of divine guidance despite clear warnings. In Surah An-Nisa, Allah severely warns those who unjustly consume the property of orphans, stating that they are, in reality, swallowing nothing but fire into their bellies, and that they will inevitably be roasted in Sa'ir. The orphan represents the most vulnerable segment of any society, lacking the natural protection and advocacy of parents. Islam mandates the highest degree of social justice, fairness, and protective care for the weak, and thus, exploiting an orphan's inheritance or resources is considered an act of profound moral bankruptcy and extreme injustice. The raging fire of Sa'ir perfectly corresponds to the burning greed that led a person to betray a sacred societal trust for temporary worldly gain. Additionally, in Surah Al-Mulk, Sa'ir is described as the destination for those who actively rebelled against the truth and rejected the messengers sent by Allah. The Quran illustrates a chilling dialogue at this gate, where the angelic keepers of hell ask the newly arriving inhabitants if a warner had ever come to them in the worldly life. The inhabitants, overwhelmed by an eternity of regret, will confess their guilt, admitting that warners did indeed come, but they lied, rejected the message, and arrogantly claimed that Allah had revealed nothing. Their ultimate confession is one of the most heartbreaking statements in the Quran. They say that if only they had truly listened or utilized their intellect, they would not be among the companions of the blazing flame. This highlights a foundational Islamic principle, that God bestowed upon humanity both the faculty of reason and the light of revelation, and that ignoring or suppressing one's God-given intellect in favor of blind cultural conformity, base desires, or stubborn pride is a fatal spiritual crime. The continuous raging kindling of Sa'ir reflects the continuous and stubborn nature of their denial in life. The existence of this gate demands that believers uphold absolute integrity in all financial trusts, fiercely protect the marginalized, and maintain a heart and intellect that are constantly open, receptive, and obedient to the divine truth. Saqar. The fifth gate takes its deeply sobering name from an Arabic root that means to scorch, melt, or alter the flesh through intense, unbearable heat, representing a fire that spares nothing and leaves nothing intact. This level is described with terrifying precision in Surah Al-Mudaththir, where it is noted for its ability to completely darken and destroy the skin, continuously renewing the torment, and is guarded by exactly 19 stern angels who execute the divine decree without hesitation or mercy. The Quran provides a profound glimpse into the specific moral and spiritual failures that lead humanity into this scorching abyss, through a dialogue between the inhabitants of paradise and the denizens of this fire. When asked, "What led you into Saqar?" the condemned identify 4 sequential breakdowns in their religious and social obligations. First, they confess that they were not of those who performed the Salah, the obligatory daily prayers. By abandoning the prayer, they severed their primary life-giving connection to their Creator, stripping their lives of spiritual discipline and divine remembrance. Second, they admit that they did not feed the poor. This reveals that the death of their spiritual connection to God immediately resulted in the death of their empathy and compassion toward God's creation, illustrating the unbreakable Islamic link between ritual worship and social responsibility. Third, they confess that they engaged in vain, idle, and mocking talk with those who engaged in it. This encompasses spreading falsehoods, mocking the religion, wasting time on destructive worldly pursuits, and intellectual dishonesty, sins that corrode the fabric of truth within a society. Finally, they state that they actively denied the day of recompense until the ultimate certainty of death overtook them. The denial of the hereafter is the philosophical root of all their preceding failures. Without the belief in ultimate accountability, there is no compelling reason to pray, no mandate to sacrifice wealth for the poor, and no restraint on the destructive use of the tongue. The punishment of Saqar, which relentlessly scorches and alters the physical form, perfectly mirrors the way these individuals completely altered and degraded their own original pure human nature through persistent neglect and disbelief. The meticulous exactness of this recompense reminds the believer that a holistic Islamic life requires strict adherence to ritual obligations, profound generosity to the needy, disciplined and purposeful speech, and a heart continuously anchored in the undeniable reality of the Day of Judgment. The sixth gate derives its name from a root referring to a fierce, huge, violently staring fire built within a deep pit, often fueled by an immense accumulation of coals and wood. Throughout the Quran, this intensely confining and suffocating level of hell is frequently associated with the concept of tughyan, which translates to crossing the established boundaries, extreme transgression, arrogant oppression, and outright rebellion against the divine order. In Surah An-Nazi'at, the Quran explicitly states that for the one who transgressed all bounds and preferred the life of this world over the hereafter, al-Jahim will undoubtedly be their refuge. This level is uniquely designated for the tyrants, the active idolaters, and those individuals who not only disbelieved, but aggressively fought against the prophets, utilizing their worldly power, wealth, and influence to suppress the truth and oppress the believers. The psychological state that leads a person to al-Jahim is rooted in a total infatuation with the dunya, the material world. When a human being becomes entirely absorbed by worldly ambitions, convincing themselves that this temporary life is the ultimate reality and the only measure of success, they inevitably begin to compromise morality, oppress others, and ignore the divine limits to achieve their desires. They cross the boundaries of justice and humility, adopting a pharaonic arrogance where they view themselves as independent sovereigns rather than dependent servants of Allah. The punishment of al-Jahim, a fiercely confined, suffocating pit of intense fire, is the exact cosmic opposite of the expansive, unbridled freedom and unchecked power they falsely assumed they possessed on earth. By contrasting the fate of the transgressor with the righteous believer, the one who feared standing before their Lord and actively restrained their soul from base, unlawful desires, Islam highlights the absolute necessity of jihad and nafs, the internal spiritual struggle against the ego. The existence of al-Jahim serves as a stark, monumental warning against the delusion of materialism and the intoxication of power. It teaches the faithful that the temporary glitz of the worldly life must never be elevated above the eternal commands of God, and that true success is found exclusively in humility, strict observance of ethical boundaries, and the constant, sobering awareness that every soul will eventually be brought forth to stand in absolute submission before the Lord of all the worlds. Al-Hawiyah, the seventh and absolute lowest gate of the fire, bears a name that translates to the deep abyss, the bottomless pit, or the terrifying void into which one continuously falls. Mentioned explicitly in Surah Al-Qariyah, it is declared to be the inevitable abode for the one whose scales of good deeds are profoundly light, devoid of any spiritual weight or sincerity. Because it is the lowest level of the fire, it is consequently the most intensely hot, the most crushing, and the most severe in its unending torment. The Islamic tradition, deriving from the explicit statements in Surah An-Nisa, which decree that the hypocrites will be in the absolute lowest depths of the fire, associates al-Hawiyah primarily with the crime of nifaq, or major hypocrisy. In the Islamic theological framework, major hypocrisy is an act of ultimate spiritual treason. It is the condition of an individual who outwardly proclaims the testimony of faith, physically prays among the Muslims, and pretends to be a devout member of the community, while internally concealing absolute disbelief, harboring hatred for the truth, and actively working to undermine the religion from within. The hypocrite is considered worse than the open disbeliever because their deception represents a malicious weaponization of faith itself, causing severe psychological and societal damage to the Muslim community under the guise of brotherhood. The punishment perfectly reflects the crime. Just as the hypocrite lived a life that was fundamentally empty, hollow, and devoid of any true substance or sincerity, their eternal recompense is to be cast into a dark, bottomless void. In a profoundly terrifying and poetic linguistic turn, the Quran describes al-Hawiyah as the mother of the one whose scales are light. Just as a mother tightly embraces her child and serves as their ultimate refuge, the blazing, inescapable abyss of al-Hawiyah will violently embrace the hypocrite, becoming their only remaining sanctuary and their eternal companion. On the day of judgment, when all human actions are placed upon the divine scales of justice, the mizan, it is not merely the outward quantity of deeds that generates weight, but rather the purity of intention, the sincerity of the heart, and strict adherence to the prophetic example. The horrifying reality of al-Hawiyah stands as the ultimate spiritual deterrent against performative religion and hidden malice, cementing the core Islamic truth that Allah sees beyond all earthly disguises, that true salvation relies entirely upon pure, unadulterated sincerity, and that a life built upon deception will ultimately collapse into an empty, blazing ruin.